think we may start. Let me just recall that many years ago, in fact, about, I think, 1520, I read about a conference on environmental law, one of the first to be held in Italy, in a lovely island off Sicily, the island of Ustica. The organizers were offering transportation, hotel, meals, and you only had to be there and possibly applaud. So my wife was an administrative lawyer, and so she was very interested in that conference. And I was too, as a faithful husband, as well as a professor of law. So we decided to apply, and we had the free transportation to, oh, it was June, by the way, I forgot to say, it was early in June. And we had free transportation by hydrofoil to Ustica and the return as well, and we had spent there, I suppose, 3-4 days. And it happened we happened to find out that the organizer was Mr. Silvio Berlusconi, who was inviting many administrative, and I can say it on the internet because it's all true, was inviting many prominent administrative judges, plus a few academics like myself, and we had a very nice time. And of course the program was a lecture between 12 and 1 in the morning, and then of course at 1 you had lunch. Then there was another lecture between 5 and 6 before an exhibition of fashion, and then aperitif, and then we also had some exhibition of coral jewelry. So it was very, very nice. But why I'm telling you is that because on the very first day we went to breakfast with tie and jacket and typical city dress, and the very last day we went directly in swimming suit to have breakfast, because we knew what the story was like, and we knew that after breakfast we could go to the beach. And I raced with some prominent members of the Council of State. So it was a completely different story. Now, I don't want to I'm not making any further comment on the organization, but just to see that we are now at the very end of our lecture, and I think we are very relaxed by all means. And although, of course, we still keep the same scientific attention, which is always necessary, we can, as I said, in a very relaxed and informal way, proceed with listening to the papers. Now, Cheryl thought, and I agree with her, that it was better to have Jens Woelk's presentation first, as in a way it relates to what we heard about Northern Ireland, although the conflict in Northern Ireland seemed to be more a gender conflict than a religious or ideological or social class conflict. But I'm afraid that both conflicts, in fact, have been quite dramatic also in human lives. So let's be prepared now to have the contribution by Jens Woelk, whom I do not introduce, to the conference. And you know that I'll be very strict. You have 25 minutes, and then we have plenty of time for discussion. And many things that you won't be able to say in your presentation will be said during the discussion.
Very good. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. I don't know whether you have chosen the right topic for after lunch. I don't know whether it's possible to zip the Western Balkans into 25 minutes. But I try to do my best. I already lose a lot of time reading the title, which is Ethnic Federalism, Constitutional Transition, and Reflective Judiciary in Southeastern Europe. So it's clear that we are looking into a complex topic, but here I think complexity is quite well. So ethnic federalism is, of course, to be explained with the specific history of former Yugoslavia and the current situation. I will, of course, deal with this. But already maybe even earlier, you can find the living together of different groups in multinational empires, so in pre-modern, pre-democratic times. I think this is very important, that there's a root of living together, and there's also a root of organizing themselves within groups or as groups within a larger entity. I think this is important. Transition, of course, post-conflict, but adding up to the complexities of Northern Ireland, I would say there's also democratic transformation, socio-economic transition, which adds to the complexity of the post-conflict situation. And reflective judiciary, which I understand here as the consideration of structural differences in society on one hand, and the respect of diversity in the judicial organization on the other. What we are talking about, of course, this has not been said as far as I remember during our discussions, is of course not limited to Southeastern Europe, but we are living here and discussing within a region where we have actually a reflection of diversity in the judiciary in the province of Bolzano with a different quota system. So also South Tyrol is now covered, as I promised during the lunch break. But also we have the example of the Belgian Constitutional Court, where we have 6 + 6 judges at the Constitutional Court in order to reflect the two language communities, major language communities of Belgium. But I cannot lose time with these interesting cases. I have to go straight to Southeastern Europe. And this is a map of the so-called Western Balkans. So I won't refer actually to Albania, although we might have some issues also there, but I will refer probably to the Western, I will stick to the Western Balkans definition, which is former Yugoslavia minus Slovenia, and here in the special case without Albania. My main hypothesis is that it's not all about ethnic diversity. So this is certainly an important point, but it's not all. And I could also give this talk when I would focus more on Bosnia in the section on federalism. I'm probably rightly inserted, and I will deal with this also in the section with regard to the internationalization and the international judges. So it has much to do with the transition, much to do with statehood problems, as it is also said in literature, the question of, as I have framed it here, no, in the next slide then, as of unfinished states. So it's important here, I think, the issue of stability. And when we are mapping reflective judiciary in Southeastern Europe, then I think we should distinguish at least these 3 levels. One is the international involvement. So this is international judges, which we had / still have in Bosnia and Kosovo. You see the asterisk, so I don't go into the footnote of 1244 because Kosovo is, of course, not yet recognized by all states. And we also have the International Criminal Court on former Yugoslavia exerting power from the outside and pressure from the outside. I think this is to be mentioned too. Then we have mixed institutions. Again, it depends a bit also on the time dimension. There is a chronological dimension too, so there's a change from mere international institutions or dominated institutions to mixed institutions to then, in some cases, not yet reached mere domestic institutions. So this is Bosnia and Kosovo. Then at constitutional levels, we everywhere find principles for the representation of diversity, sometimes very general, all public bodies, public service or something like that, so the judiciary only implicitly mentioned, sometimes very specifically, and sometimes even related, as I will show you, to specific courts. What I also like to mention here are the councils of the judiciary, because the French and Spanish and Italian council model of self-governing the judiciary has spread out first in Central and Eastern Europe, now in Southeastern Europe, and is very important because the diversity question plays an important role here, according to also what John has said before, because these are the institutions strongly involved in the appointment, in the selection and appointment process, as a kind of interface between politics, and especially the parliamentary institutions, and judges with reservation according to common European standards. I will deal with this also afterwards, that there has to be guaranteed a majority of judges, because functionally these shall be counterweights to politics and shall strengthen the independence of judges, especially important during the transition phase. And then, of course, we have also ordinary legislation, ordinary courts, and in the middle, the constitutional courts and Supreme Court. So my question is whether there is always the same logic or whether we can and have to apply different logics. Looking into the approaches, we had a long talk this morning on the affirmative action model. This is probably the dominant model, I would dare to say, in the Western Balkans too, but there are very different degrees in forms of intensity, in forms of detailedness of the regulation, of the different regulations. But this is particularly the case in Bosnia, Herzegovina, in Kosovo, and in Macedonia. I think these are the most important cases for a strong application of legal guarantees, while we also have linked to these general clauses on representation also mere political considerations and sometimes mentioning of this representation principle only in minority protection laws. Yes? But they are present everywhere. Another problem is, and again I can link a bit to John because I have a personal experience with a peer review of the judiciary in these countries, in some of these countries in particular in Bosnia and in Macedonia for the EU Commission. And there I had also access to data. Otherwise data is a problem because this is sensitive data, especially in the EU legislation, and you won't find a progress report on Macedonia or on Bosnia or on any other country where it's spelled out in detailed way how the ethnic composition plays out. Of course, it's always mentioned because it's a problem, and it's seen also as a guarantee of, in particular, independence of the institutions. But this is really a problem. I give you another example. There's the European Commission for the Efficiency of Justice with the Council of Europe. I already wrote, I think, 4 times, never get an answer. There is a report on the internet of 400 pages, and you find 10 pages in detailed way about gender balances, but on the Western Balkans you don't find a word on ethnic. Ethnic and minorities is mentioned only when it comes to victims, and only to victims, but there's not no detailed specification about these ethnic balances. So you see that's a very sensitive, although it's very present, it's very difficult to grasp it. And this has probably also something to do with the legacy of ethnic federalism, because there is a kind of ethnic Midas touch. So everything which is in a way touched by the ethnic issue then gets wider and wider and influences also wider fields. And this has something to do with this legacy, I think, which is of course at the source also of the problems of the conflicts in former Yugoslavia. I don't have the time to go deeper into this, but you know that the republics had so-called titular peoples, and this was also the reason why we have the difficulty in recognizing, one of the reasons, recognizing the self-determination in terms of external independence of Kosovo. But what from my point here is important, there is this underlying perception maybe or notion or that the population of one territorial entity can be identified is homogeneous, and can be identified with a specific group or people. And this has played out, of course, in the conflict with the nation-state building in former Yugoslavia, in the former Yugoslav area, and with the disadvantage, to say it mildly, or ethnic cleansing in the worst cases in some of these parts. And here is, of course, the distinction where conflict has been much more violent and there has been more ethnic cleansing, like in Bosnia, Kosovo, and Macedonia. We have also seen, as you can see on the slide, direct international intervention and imposition or at least strong influence from the outside, while Croatia, Montenegro, and Serbia, there we see much more indirect influence exercised through conditionality criteria, through requests, and of course also ICTY, so on. And so this explains to some extent the differences in the single countries. As I said, there's also time, because in the literature there's a debate about a kind of learning curve from Bosnia and Kosovo as protectorates to softer third-way solutions like in Macedonia, where the international community and the EU in particular in 2001 has brokered the Ohrid Framework Agreement as a constitutional foundation, leaving afterwards the implementation practically completely to the Macedonians themselves. But this is very rough orientation, of course, and we can discuss this. We can also question this, especially regarding our topic, whether there is really such a third way. What is clear is that there are these variables, which is security in the sense of the degree of violent conflict, neighbors, there is contested statehood, and this is very much influencing the constitutional tradition. I have also put down here the end of tradition with a question mark, because I would dare to say that in most of these countries, transition is not yet has not yet come to an end. Also because a further complication, I promised you it's not the right presentation after lunch, but a further complication adds to all this: EU accession, or the prospect of EU accession, and further reforms which are, and this has to be stressed, guided by different criteria and different conditions, which is much more the efficiency of the judiciary. And here also the merit criteria come in much more prominently than before, because the very aim of the reforms for becoming a member of the EU is actually guaranteeing the implementation of the acquis communautaire. Why reflective judiciary? Again, I can also say something, but I don't have the time on, and I can build on what John Morrison has already said on the important role of the judiciary in transition. Here, we have to add the dimension of transition from a former socialist system and the unity of party and state institutions, the non-independence, at least in substantial terms, of the judiciary in the idea of the unity of power. Now, this is, shall be contrasted by constitutional guarantees of independence, by a cultural change, new values, in particular human rights, international human rights, which, of course, have to be enforced. And the first step is to create an independent judiciary which is apt to make this cultural change. And then afterwards, as I said, there is the question of EU accession. This is all based, of course, on international norms. When it comes now a bit closer to the reflection and representation in the judiciary, which is the Framework Convention, which is very general in nature. It just says participation in public life, and then we can start to invent what this concretely means. We are assisted by the OSCE recommendations of the High Commissioner on National Minorities from Lund, which spell this out and which also mention, at least implicitly again, the judiciary. And the difficulty is actually here. We have quite detailed regulations in these binding, non-binding minority instruments, but these are related to the either political sphere, representation in parliaments, assemblies, local governments, or to the public administration. There is practically a gap when it comes to the judiciary. The next thing where we could look for is power sharing arrangements, because most of these are in some way power sharing arrangement. But as a concept having been developed by political scientists, I would dare to say it is very self-understanding that arbitration and judicial settlements of controversy are not much in the foreground. So we don't find much here. In the first Leipart models, this is not even foreseen. You have the veto powers, but you don't have any regulation on how to overcome these. Now there's a book by McCrudden O'Leary, Courts and Consociations, which is quite interesting, but it's very much against courts meddling into these power-sharing affairs, if I may summarize this in one sentence, just for the sake of time, but this is quite interesting. I would say there is a different justification also for having the reflection in the judiciary. We have talked about this in particular. I think in our cases, this is because the judiciary is part of the state. It's the question of institutional independence and this cultural change. The problem is that exactly the affiliation requirement of the single judge individually might then de facto or perceived run counter to this impartiality requirement, which is again part of the independence of the judges. I just want to mention, because I think this is also very important, that in Southeastern Europe, of course, we are talking about civil law systems and we are talking about career systems. So a lot of what has been discussed before, also in terms of differences, is applicable here, in particular when it comes to the selection of young candidates when it comes to the importance, probably even higher importance of education. I don't have the time, but I think this is also quite interesting to look into the efforts which are made in order to create, strengthen, and try to give an independent role to judicial training academies, which in some countries are really organized like independent administrative agencies in order to start with independence actually already during education, where a pre-selection takes place. For me, I think the penultimate point is very important, the acceptance through inclusion. I would characterize the sense of ethnic representation as this, so in particular for minority members who are otherwise, as we have discussed this morning, structurally excluded from participating in justice. And the other point, I think, is guaranteeing the cultural change. And here is a strong role for international judges who do this and who contribute to this from the outside in order to stabilize. And this was all probably very complex, very long. I now will look into some cases in order to show you, and I try to, it doesn't work out, I have to admit, doesn't work out perfectly, this kind of trilogy I wanted to construct, but I try. So I start with the role of international judges, just very briefly, because also Cheryl will talk about this role afterwards in different contexts. So here we have, of course, in Kosovo as an example, the role of international judges during the period of the United Nations administration in Kosovo, when judicial power was almost fully under control of the international community, in particular in being reserved to the sphere of reserved powers of the special representatives of the Secretary General and the UNMIC Department of Justice. International judges were operational. There were a lot of problems, short-term contracts, for example, the ad hoc assignment of cases, international judges and prosecutors who could take cases away from Kosovo judges. And the question, which also was raised this morning, I think, by Marco, was the question of accountability. Is there someone the international judges have to respond to? And in part, this has then been improved, in part it has not. In the following phase, which is in a way characterized by the impact of European Union engagement in Kosovo with ULEX. And here we have now mixed panels, so this is a move towards a mixed model, a kind of, if you want, emancipation of domestic actors, but this is a very patriarchistic, how do you say? Patriarchic view of things, which already might be telling. And there's, of course, also a special situation in the north of Kosovo, where we have these municipalities with a Serb majority population, where the normal Kosovo judiciary is not yet accepted, and where we have a continuity and continuation of ULEX judges and prosecutors, although this is, again, under change. My favorite case and the most complex one is, of course, Bosnia-Herzegovina, which I would characterize from the beginning as a mixed system, because there was much more emphasis, also because their statehood was the fiction to be realized, by contrast with Kosovo before. So please have always statehood and the contestation of statehood in minds. But when it comes to cultural change, of course, with the Human Rights Chamber, for example, we have a strong emphasis on outside control, which was run practically with at least a dominance, a majority of international judges, so it was still a mixed institution, but it was operating in parallel to the Constitutional Court. So there are persons who have called this period an institutional overkill of human rights institution, but this was probably a kind of shock therapy after the conflict, after the war. There are other commissions which have been run more or less by internationals, the Property Claims Commission and so on, all having their basis in the Dayton Peace Agreement rather than in the Constitution, which is also part of the Dayton Peace Agreement, leading also to coordination problems sometimes. And this is one of the reasons why in the constitutional transition then the Human Rights Chambers has been transferred into the Constitutional Court, first as an autonomous section, then afterwards fully now, and this is the current situation, under control of the Constitutional Court. What about the court? The court itself is very easy to explain, 3 plus 6, so because it's an American-style constitutional court, although it's not an apex court, but a separate constitutional court. Very interestingly, in Bosnia, there is no state constitutional court, so your model does not apply to Bosnia, the left one, but we only have Supreme Courts in the entities which, according to the compromise, were actually dominant in controlling everything in terms of powers, competencies, including the judiciary. And at state level, the only thing you find in the constitution is actually the constitutional court. And here you have the composition 6-3, 3 international judges, which are not international, but they are foreign. They cannot be from citizens of neighboring countries, but of course they have to represent, in a way, the international community, which is part in the Dayton Peace Agreement, broker, and part of the post-war compromise and the stabilizing element, as I said, and so directly involved even in the constitutional court, although it is to be considered a domestic institution. So this is a quite complex situation. Even more complicated by the fact that Bosnia is neither an ethnic system nor a federal system, but an ethno-territorial system, which is also asymmetric. So you have to have some familiarity with the Bosnian situation, because I don't have the time to go deeper into this, but this explains this magic formula 2-2-2 versus 4-2, because 2-2-2 means that there are 2 judges from each of the 3 constituent people, although the constitutional fiction is that it's the entity parliaments voting on a territorial basis, that is, voting for the members in the constitutional court. And as the population relations is 2/3 to 1/3, but strangely this matches with the tripartite situation of the constituent peoples. You have in practice the situation that each constituent people is represented, although the logic of election is actually, in strict formalistic terms, territorial one. So this is complicated. If you look at the judgments, and I don't only want to do positive law here, then you see, though, that very often in important judgment there has been a majority of the Bosniak, 2 Bosniak, in quotation marks, judges, because then you know the ethnic affiliation, of course, after and before them being elected, plus the 3 international judges. So these are the state supporting majority, while very often, not always, but there is a scheme, while on the other hand, very often the Serb and the Croat judges have voted in important state supporting questions against the majority. So this is, I think, quite important, looking again at the state building agenda. Then we have the constitutional courts in the entities, which is a bit different, because here we have a new element because the entity constitutions have been amended by imposition from the High Representative of the international community. So constitution building imposed from the outside, and here something modern has been included, the representation also of others, so of those who are not part of the 3 constituent peoples, which is now a very important case in the political sphere due to the Sejdić-Finci judgment of the European Court of Human Rights of 2009. But this goes too far. What's also, I think, important is the High Judiciary and Prosecutorial Council, established without any fundament in the Constitution by decree of the International High Representative, and also a state court and a state public prosecutor. So there has been a state judiciary now been established, and the council actually was important during the tradition. It has been governed by the international community directly, by international members in also the reappointment process of judges, so also what we have discussed before, whom is actually able to continue after such a conflict. But it's now, of course, institution which is a domestic institution and where the 3 constituent peoples are represented. The country I cannot call Macedonia, as you usually refer to it. So this is a different approach. The approach is equitable representation. And here is the balancing act of persons, so the individual dimension, but also, of course, taking into account the collective dimension belonging to communities in public bodies at all levels. So this is the general principle. And then, without having the time of going into details here, here's a difference because this is formulated in a neutral way, referring to the communities who are not majority in Macedonia. So it's not minorities, but it's not constituent people either. So something in between, an ambiguity here. And you need, usually in different versions, a so-called double majority. According to the French badinter, it's called badinter majority. So you say that you need usually a majority of everybody who is involved in the election process, for example, Parliament, for example, the Judicial Council, and within that majority has to be included a majority of those members who have been elected or who are members of the non-majority community. So this is the double threshold. And this is now played out in different things. You need you see the Judicial Council is, like in Italy, composed of, has three different components. One from the judges, this is the majority component, one from Parliament and one by the President. And in each component, one part, so 3 out of 8 the judges, 1 out of 3 in Parliament, and 1 out of 2 of the members nominated by the President have to represent members of the non-majority communities. If you want to go in more details, then you can also say, look, we are looking into the areas where these non-majority communities reside. If they exceed 20% of the population in these areas, this is the general criterion in Macedonia, then specific rules apply, and these members have a specific role in determining who can be appointed and selected as a judge. I have, unfortunately, probably come to the end. I try to speed up. In Macedonia, when we had the interviews, very often the question of merit came out. So we know who the people are, and this is clear because the community is very small. The merit is important, and only if 2 candidates are equally merited, have equal merit, then we can prefer one of them. This was the question. In Macedonia, this works probably relatively well if you look at the statistics, because there's strong political influence. And by contrast with the other systems, in Macedonia, there has been a tradition of having always coalition government without that being only imposed through the power sharing of a Macedonian Slavic party and a smaller Albanian party. And the same scheme you have in the opposition. You have a larger Macedonian party and a smaller Albanian party. So even with a government change, you have the other coalition, and this is guaranteed. And this is why probably the quota, which is only an informal one and not a formal quota system, works quite well. The price is probably that merit is not always considered and that the political influence, of course, is quite high. Then looking into Kosovo, we see that after independence, the situation has changed in a way which is much more reminding of what we see in Macedonia, actually. We have very precise guarantees, and I just want to draw your attention to this. Precise rules on the representation in court. This goes for the Supreme Court. There's a minimum requirement of 15% or 3 non-majority judges. Then we have the same as with courts with appellate functions, and we have specific rules for the areas where the Serb minority is concentrated in the north of Kosovo, where only the Serb members can express their opinion on the appointment, which can be overcome in some cases, but this is definitely too complicated. In other countries like in Montenegro, Croatia, Serbia, and if you want, we can also mention Albania here, we have general clauses on proportional representation of minorities, and these always usually make a reference to the representation of gender. May I 2 more minutes? Okay, then the question is here, as always, when we talk about the Western Balkans, standards. Where do these standards come from? And as always in the Western Balkans, not always, but very often, these standards are myth because they do not exist in the sense of binding legal standards, but they are usually soft law. if you don't count the rights and non-discrimination provisions in the European Convention on Human Rights and the Framework Convention, which are either not directly applicable, the latter, or not specific enough, the former. So if it comes really to the organization of the judiciary and the reflection, of course we do not have, the systems in Europe are too different for having indications, but we have recommendations of various kinds, in particular of the Consultative Council of European Judges, which contains some indication, but not regarding directly the representation of ethnicity. And here we have the Venice Commission, which is now for more than a decade actually rowing against what I'm just saying and against what we can state in the Balkans, which we can map in the Balkans, so the ethnicization of the judiciary, because it clearly says that here I have quoted the one from 2005 already, but I can also quote one from last year on the draft law of the High Judicial and Prosecutorial Council in Bosnia, which says, avoiding quota setting ethnic lines as they may undermine the effective functioning of the system for a country the size of Bosnia, and this is true because we have a problem of size here too, like you also mentioned with regard to Northern Ireland. And since it is important that the judiciary is not be organized along ethnic lines, I think that this is very much in counter tendency. This is very much Strasbourg, this is very much Western Europe, but it's not taken sufficiently into account the situation in the Balkans. And here I go back to pre-democratic, pre-modern times where representation in a way has always been the custom or the habit at least. But I think it's also an assistance to the discussion of implementing finally the Sejdic-Finci judgment and other judgment which have actually by the European Court of Human Rights condemned the exclusion of those who are not members of the constituent peoples from certain offices and parliament terms. So, coming to the very last slide and summing up, I think we should distinguish here between the different logics reflective judiciary in Southeastern Europe has, because there is not a single one. We have a combination of stability and consolidation considerations with domestic guarantees for minorities, and in the end of the state, because the state is imitating the nation-state model, which we find elsewhere in Europe, but cannot actually fully do so, because this would mean the exclusion of a lot of minority groups in the state. Just for the very last sentence, complicated now everything by the preparation for EU accession, which is very much undecided with, on the one hand, merit, and EU acquis, and on the other hand, of course, guaranteeing a pluralist kind of democracy, which, or an indicator for which, is actually also having these minority groups represented in the judiciary. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jens, also for respecting the time limits. And in fact, it has been sort of a piano concert that you gave us. Very smooth, very ongoing. Let me just mention one thing, that one of the points to be considered here is that power sharing is a sort of general model for all the institutions. There are reserved seats in parliament, for instance. In Bosnia-Herzegovina, you even have a 3-person head of state, which is quite unusual, and with the exception of Switzerland, of course, but we don't want to compare Switzerland and Bosnia-Herzegovina. And mind you, this 3-person head of state also share the supreme command of the armed forces. And you understand that in a power-sharing arrangement, sharing the supreme command of the armed forces between communities that were at war with one another until 1 year before is a very provisional arrangement. The point here, as Jens very well pointed out, is that what should have been a provisional arrangement apparently is pleasing at least the ruling elites, the political parties that have perhaps even a personal interest in preserving the situation. So the point here is, should the judiciary be the exception to the power-sharing rule, or should it not? Of course, you might argue in both directions, again, taking into consideration on whether you are in a transition or whether you have a permanent arrangement. Thank you very much again. So let's have the same. Yes, John, you're the first, then anybody else. We take 3 questions at a time. Please.
Thank you. Thank you, Jens, for that very illuminating presentation. This is an area I've been looking at out of this corner of my eye, and I'm pleased to have been given a very clear run-through of the main issues. My question is a very simple question, just a request for information. And I suppose in a way trying to see whether or not this is working, in a sense of proof of the pudding being in the eating. Who's using the courts? Who is using the courts? Are they used to the same extent and with the same degree of confidence by all the different groupings?
Okay, so would you like to start answering this question?
Yeah. No, the answer is also relatively simply. I'm not aware of differences compared to our countries, to Western Europe, Central Europe. There are a lot of utility cases, there are a lot of normal cases. In some countries they have built up an administrative justice, in other countries this is a bit more complex, but I think this is very, very similar. There was a huge problem of backlogs, which is also an indicator of causes frequently used, maybe also abused for these utility cases. This was a huge problem some years ago, and there have been specific reforms. There are ombudspersons also dealing with the malfunctioning of the judiciary in non-formal procedural terms. There is, as you mentioned, also of course, help and free access to justice. So there are these programs, which are also an indicator for the maturity of the system used by the European Commission for when peer reviewing, when evaluating the functioning of the system. So I'm not aware of courts not being used sufficiently. But I'm also not aware of specific statistics saying these are only used, let's say, by Albanians or only used by... I think this depends also very much then on the areas, again, no? Because in some countries you have concentrated, in others not. It's very difficult to say. But I'm not aware of a debate and of all the material I read that there are specific problems with one group not using the courts, for example, which I would probably have noticed.
Matthias Hartwig, anybody else?
Thank you very much. Yeah, it links up to the question before. We have to make an assessment of what has been done, also specifically when the international community was included, there has been a sort of responsibility taken over. And I recently met the Kosovo Constitutional Court, and among them there was a Portuguese, international judge, a Portuguese, and he made, I must tell you, a devastating assessment of the international participation of the ULEX in this area of the judiciary. And the main, not speaking specifically on the Constitutional Court, but he said that, you know, the main scope was to eliminate the corruption there in these areas, and they did not reach this goal. On the contrary, the ULEX was infected by the corruption, and we had this scandal last year, and it has never been, by the way, investigated correctly. And I think here we must reflect on the possibilities and the effectiveness of the participation, international participation in such a situation. Thank you.
Anybody else? No, may I then? Oh, yes, go ahead, please.
Excuse me. My question
Sorry,
ties...
Anna Mastromarino.
I
just say...
Anna Mastromarino. My question ties to the Roberto comment, and I said instead, can judiciary be not an exception, but to be the beginning to overcome the power sharing system in a perspective of integration? I think is the case of Belgium, and so is a. Thank you.
Yes, Laura Montanari.
something about international judges. International judges reflect international community view, or they reflect their own culture or their own experience, national experience?
Anybody else? So I have two small issues here. The first, again, has to do with international judges. I have discussed it with Jens already, so I think it might be interesting to have your opinion and share it with all of us. I wonder to what extent you can consider all the components within the court, the components of the diversity in the court, as stakeholders of the system. And the international community, from this point of view, would be part of the stakeholders. In other words, there is an interest of the international community to preserve the polity as it is, whether it is correct or not correct. But there is an interest. And so this is the idea that there is an integration. Of course, we shouldn't forget that this solution has been imposed on countries. It has been imposed as part of the peace agreement. So perhaps you might add, and this perhaps is more clear for what I'm going to say now, to what extent would Bosnia-Herzegovina alone have adopted such a solution? So to what extent is it imposed, or to what extent it is sort of a claim to include power sharing within the judiciary? And the second remark would be that we have to, perhaps in such cases, we have to see diversity in the judiciary as part of the wider checks and balances network. And so that the checks and balances network within the court reflects the checks and balances network which is also outside of the judiciary. I think that Cheryl would like to add something, and then Marco, yes? We need the microphone, please. Professor Saunders here, first line. First row, in fact.
Thank you.
And then
no,
Marco
it was
Dani.
just your remark about the stakeholders, actually, Roberto, because I mean we're coming on to this international judge thing in the next session. But I was reading something that Constance Graver had said, because she was, and I think still is, a member of the Constitutional Court of Bosnia-Herzegovina, and she gave a talk not so long ago, I think, where she was talking about it as internationalized constitutionalism. So she wasn't she was partly, of course, talking about the court, but she was also talking about the way in which the Constitution was made in the first place, and the sort of the infusion of international elements right throughout the system. And so it wasn't clear to me either whether it was regarded as transitional or ongoing, as just an example of what's happening to constitutions in the world and part of the story of global constitutionalism, if you believe in that.
Marco Dani.
Yes. While you were presenting, Jens, I was wondering about the social legitimacy of these arrangements, in these court arrangements. And this is something related to what Roberto asked. Of course, for lawyers it's always difficult to gauge the social legitimacy of a specific institutional setting. But an interesting way to look at it could be to see what is the perception of scholars in those countries. For instance, these arrangements are just tolerated as something which has been imposed and we have to make do with this. But at a certain point, when these polities will regain some degree of constitutional self-determination, they will simply get rid and have some different arrangement. Or this is something which is appreciated, which is changing the institutional culture, and perhaps it is something that could be confirmed as a sign of constitutional identity of these polities. Do you have elements to answer to this? conundrum.
One quick footnote to that. What about power sharing within the academy? Because that may be also an issue.
So, I start from the last point and try to link the points, which is not easy, but I think we cannot rely too much on the academy. This is the first point. I think there is this is also part of the transformation, that it's very, that it starts now, I would say, that we have a debate, but in the first 10 years after the conflict, you remember the conference we attended in Sarajevo in 1999.
May I just say there were three tables for coffee break for each community. And of course, we were guests, but we were afraid if we would take coffee break at the Bosniaks table, then the other two communities would think that we were united with the Bosniaks. And the same way, so we skipped coffee break because we didn't want to have the hostility of the other communities.
On one hand. On the other hand, of what everybody knows each other, and there are also cross-community relations. So it's a very, very ambiguous thing. What I wanted to stress also is that we are talking about relatively small communities. So, for example, it's not easy now to finance a legal review for having debate, for commenting judgments, not even with informatics means and so on. So I think here is a great lack of the European Union, for example, of spending money on these things, creating a kind also of cross-national legal debate, because many questions like corruption, like trafficking in human beings, organized crime, have a still, I won't say Yugoslav dimension, but at least Western Balkan dimension. And here's the problem again, no? If you want to finance this, then this is immediately seen as something which is re-establishing a region which the states have actually destroyed 20 years ago. This is one of the problems, but unfortunately you cannot rely too much on academia. We have discussed this briefly during the coffee break. Also there's a spreading of private law schools now, for example, yeah, which give the title, and you have the title for entering in the public administration or in the courts, but you don't have preparation which is in any way similar to, in terms of quality, we have here. And due to the political influence there is on the appointment process, very often this is a sufficient title for getting in anyway. So you cannot rely too much on this. Social legitimacy, this is a very good question, but I would rephrase it, if you allow, and include also the population, not only scholars, for the reasons I just said. And here I think we have to distinguish strongly between the sphere of ordinary courts and prosecutors and the constitutional sphere. When it comes to the ordinary courts, then, and this is also evaluated in the peer review of the judiciary by the EU Commission, then you look also into the perceptions of the population, trust into institutions, and we can discuss whether this is, but it's an indicator, in the same way as there are complaints, and there is a much higher degree of transparency also. When you go into the courts, you know what the judges are deciding about the cases. It's much, much, much more transparent than Italian courts, German courts, because, of course, they have skipped some stages also in this and have introduced new technology from beforehand. So this is very interesting, and I think there is a growing potential of, as you call it, you didn't say consensus, but you were even going one stage further. I would remain here a consensus with these institutions in the way that these are delivering service. Yeah, and I think this is very positive, and this is of course also service influenced by a cultural change from the bottom. And I think, but this takes time. I'm talking now 20 years after the conflicts in most of these countries, and I would separate this from the higher layer of constitutional sphere, and here I take up what you have been saying about being part of checks and balances, and this means being part of politics, especially with this past of unity of power exercised by one party, and here's a problem, because then very often, especially this representation, reflection in court is on one hand necessary, but on the other hand is of course also identified of taking sides with a specific political faction. And here I would add to our discussion we had before on the shareholder-stakeholder issue, that in some cases, and I would say Kosovo for sure, but also Bosnia, the international community is even a shareholder. It's not only a stakeholder, exactly because it imposed the state and it framed the constitution, not only in imposing human rights and something abstract for the individual with a universal touch, so this is linked to your remark, Cheryl, no, with the universal constitution, but concretely saying this is the form of the state in which you have to live.
Also because it pours money into it.
Yeah.
Not little money, yes.
And this is linked to the consequent problem. And I always ask my students, and I ask you, who is the international community? I always tell my student that this is used usually when you don't know exactly which organization is responsible for what. Yeah? So, and here this links to what Laura asked with the influences of international judges. Yes, already this international, Roberto is a bit exceeding in his ambition when he says, no, these are foreign judges, because they are also international, because they are part of an international bubble in this kind of, I'm exaggerating very much, a kind of neo-colonial approach, yeah, patriarchic approach. In an abstract way, you are part of a community. In this sense, this label international is also correct. But then, in concrete terms, you are very much influenced, of course, by your own legal culture. And there is an essay by Josef Marko, for example, who has reported this from his experience in the Bosnian Constitutional Court with the Judge Feldman and discussions they had with judges from different systems. So this is all very, very complex and very not very much reflected, I would dare to say. Also because then it's transitional, it's not permanent. And then it becomes permanent, as Constance Greve, for example, is now as a second generation. She is a permanent judge.
She's again, yes? Or permanent?
No, she's the second generation, and the second generation to the Bosnian Constitutional Court of these 3 international judges has also been, has been nominated for lifetime. So, while the first generation was for 5 years, the second is for life, and you could change this with a state law, but this has not been done, and so and this is, from my point of view, very questionable, because if I said that transition, where's the end of transition, then in this case you might say the end of transition is maybe only after the last international judge has closed his office door in the Constitutional Court building in Sarajevo. I don't know whether I... Yeah, and then there's...
He has not finished.
No, one remark still. I think it's... and this was my hypothesis, and would like to hear maybe also after your opinion on this. I think this is very much linked all with the acceptance of the state also, no? Because Anna was asking the judiciary as beginning of overcoming power sharing and a sign of integration like in Belgium. I think it depends on the country you look at and on the acceptance of the state. Probably in Macedonia a bit more than, for example, in Bosnia, where we still have this huge problem of having all the powers in the entities, and not even European integration is a kind of unifying state objective, no, which delivers much more acceptance of these state institutions. And then again, we have to distinguish, as I said at the beginning, between the level of ordinary courts, where this can start, that institutions become accepted because of their delivering services effectively. But it's very difficult to think of that at the sphere of the constitutional level, where the political influence and the contestation is much stronger. So I'm afraid that even Belgium is too positive an example for many of the cases.
Yeah, I was very interested, thank you, to hear about international judges. I hadn't come across. So what are because during the break I was asking John whether there are any, not international, but foreign judges in Northern Ireland. And I was wondering whether they're... No, they're not. But
they are sending international judges.
But I think that there is something there, especially for transitional societies, and even, meta-transitional societies. I think that there is something really positive in having someone actually coming from outside with a fresh approach, with, not having grown up in the kind of, in the specific battles and the specific tensions. And so do you think that the international, I mean, I take your points about the weaknesses, but do you think that they have brought a lot of, they have added a lot to the judicial experience in these countries?
No, they definitely have. Now I could make a joke and say a lot of complication, but this would not be true. So they certainly, there is also a positive side. I'm actually not sure whether balancing both the positive sides have prevailed. And again, it's difficult because you have also to distinguish between the international judge acting operationally as a prosecutor or as a for example, as a war crime judge, and the international judge being a part of a structure like the Constitutional Court in Bosnia, where you are in a minority situation, or in the Human Rights Chamber, where you were in the majority situation. It depends also on the sectors, because human rights maybe is easier to integrate an international judge as in other questions. So I think it's really difficult to give a general yes or no answer. Certainly there are positive influences. What is absolutely positive as a German, with my German background, I would say so, is that there has been exerted influence from the outside, because otherwise things wouldn't have moved no way.
May I add that having or not having concurring opinions also does make a difference. When you're able to see a dissenting opinion coming from an international judge or a foreign judge, of course it is clearer what is at stake there.
I noted this already for my written chapter.
Oh,
No, I didn't.
Oh, I thought
present
they repeated
during my
points.
presentation, but I had already this point
Okay,
also for
yeah.
the written, because I think this is very important.
It is important, yes.
Also for our general debate, whether dissenting opinions, when you have a reflective judiciary, are permitted or not. And I think this is an important issue.
Which, as Fred said this morning,
Yeah.
is a sort of a litmus test also for the American judges. Sometimes the expectations of the president and the Senate are not met by the case of that are decided with the opinion of that particular judge. So there's no matching, and that of course is a good sign. So I would think that we thank Jens very much. He gave us very good information and a very good approach, and the conversation was very interesting. So thank you very much. And I think I thought you would start the applause, but if you don't start, and then we start with Cheryl. You have also a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation. Let me just add this as she prepares her PowerPoint. This very short experience of mine as a foreign judge in San Marino. San Marino is this very small independent republic since medieval times within the territory of Italy. In San Marino, they have three-tier judicial system: first level appeal and final court of last instance. So when the Court of Appeal gives an opinion which is different from the one of the Court of First Instance, then one of the parties may request the opinion of a foreign judge that will give an opinion then to the highest court. Now this, because San Marino is not it's 35,000 people, so it's not really so conflictual, if not between individuals. There's nothing really dramatic about it. But the idea is precisely because it is a small community, impartiality is the rationale of having this practice of requesting an opinion from a foreign judge who must be a foreigner. So this would, of course, this is quite different, but I would say it is part also of the experience of conflictual territories, not to appear partial and therefore being effectively impartial. But it's a very small experience indeed. I would say that what Cheryl is going to talk us about is much more dramatic, or maybe more dramatic.
You may be bitterly disappointed. Okay, look, the idea for this session grew out of a a talk I rather rashly had with Jens about last November when I was passing through Trento, and we both said, oh, isn't this interesting? And I thought it was interesting then, and I think it's interesting now, but I must say I don't know very much more about it now than I did then. But I am convinced that there is a lot to know, and also that it's quite a big research project, which is also quite a difficult one. So this is what we're talking about, and to some extent we've been talking about it, or an aspect of it, in Jens's session. The appointment of non-resident foreign judges, and I've said non-resident there because sometimes you can have judges who actually live in a country but just don't happen to be nationals appointed to some courts. So the appointment of non-resident foreign judges, generally, but not quite always, to term-limited judicial positions on national courts, including courts with a constitutional jurisdiction. Sometimes that's done as an aspect of foreign aid, so some benevolent, rich-ish Western country says we will give you our aid in the form of a couple of judges. It's an apparently very widespread phenomenon. It is very hard to get information about it, but I did come upon a sort of wacky website, actually, which was called Expatriate Judges and wasn't entirely accurate, even on the basis of my knowledge, but was accurate enough to make it clear that there were more than 40 states and probably much more involved in this practice, and that's a fair slice of the international community. And I'm distinguishing the phenomenon that I'm talking about from another practice, which I suspect is much less widespread, of one state using the foreign courts, using the court of another for its final appeals. And the reason I mention that is that that happens to be what Australia does. It provides the final court of appeal for the Pacific island of Nauru. Then our next session will deal with international courts. Of course, that's a similar phenomenon, similar enough to justify us all being in the same session, but different enough because international courts are drawing on international law and have the legitimacy of the international community behind them. So the questions I want to talk about is, why does it happen? Where does it happen? What issues does it raise? And do any of those issues need a solution? And if so, what might that solution be? Now, what I'm trying to do in this slide is just choose 4 different ways in which, to my knowledge, foreign judges are used. And each of them reflect somewhat different purposes, and at least 2 of them are probably sui generis, but in any event. So we've been talking about one of them, the use of foreign judges in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and I think still also in Kosovo. Yeah. And in Bosnia-Herzegovina, which I will concentrate on, 9 members of the Constitutional Court, as Jens just described to you, 3 of them appointed by the President of the European Court of Human Rights after consultation with the presidency, the 3-headed presidency of Bosnia-Herzegovina, under Article 6 of the Bosnian Constitution. In practice, experience up till now tells us that those 3 people are quite diverse in the sense that they come from different legal systems. One so far has always been from a civil law legal system, which makes sense. One has always been from a common law legal system, which makes less. And one has been from generally a central European state, not a neighbour so as to run into the constitutional prohibition, but at least close enough to have some feel for what's going on. Always very distinguished people. But it's interesting to me that that is the breakdown. Insofar as they are international rather than foreign judges, I think that story comes through the manner of appointment. But there is some real questions about how they fit into the Bosnian constitutional arrangements going forward, and that comes back to the debate we had earlier about whether this is transitional or permanent. I was interested in Jens's point, saying that they're now all appointed till the age of 70. That's certainly what the Constitution says, that all of the judges on the Constitutional Court are appointed to the age of 70. My recollection was David Feldman actually had 2 terms. And I suspect that what we might, I don't know, I need to ask, and I should ask you. I'm sure that's right. I'm sure these international judges or these foreign judges are not going to stay there till they're 70. But what will be happening is that they will resign earlier, and for all we know, they have an arrangement with the President of the European Court of Human Rights to resign early. So there's always a sort of a double relationship, or often a double relationship in these arrangements. The relationship you have under the Constitution with the government of the country to which the court belongs, and very often an arrangement also with the other country that's doing the funding or doing the appointing. So that probably deserves a little more examination. But how can we understand the rationale here? Well, we talked a little bit about that in connection with Jens's presentation. It might be transitional, but anyway, it's a form of holding the ring, trying to deal with the divisions between quite hostile communities, trying to make the whole system work, integrate it, if you like, and then work out a way to move forward. A completely different rationale, the Hong Kong Court of Final Appeal. That comprises a Chief Justice, 3 permanent judges from Hong Kong, and quite a lot of so-called non-permanent judges, including a panel of 12 overseas non-permanent judges, and that's a quote from the Hong Kong Basic Law, from other common law countries. And at least one of those overseas non-permanent judges must sit on every final appeal. What's the reason for this? It's not that Hong Kong is lacking in judicial talent at all, but it is to do with the deal that was struck between the UK and Hong Kong and the People's Republic of China when Hong Kong was returned to the PRC, where part of the deal was to keep the common law system for 50 years. And one of the ways, and maybe beyond, who knows, and one of the ways of retaining the common law for 50 years was not just to have a common law court, but to have it staffed by extremely distinguished ex-judges from across the common law world. So some of our most distinguished ex-judges from Australia, from the Australian High Court, sit on that court, and some very big UK names and New Zealand names as well. And that arrangement is, of all the ones I've tried to look at, the most transparent. The basic law is pretty straightforward about it. The implementing legislation specifically talks about these non-permanent judges and the arrangements for them, and the website actually names them and has their pictures, which is more than anybody else's website does. A third example, the Kenyan Ad Hoc Interim Independent Constitution Dispute Resolution Court. This is a response to the predilection of Kenyans to run to the courts every time they have a constitution-making exercise to challenge some decision that's been taken. In the first, or the first recent round of constitution-making in Kenya, which ultimately came to tears, someone went to a Kenyan court halfway through it and said, it's not going to be enough for the parliament to settle this constitution, there must be a referendum. And much to the government's annoyance, the court said, yes, that's right, there must be a referendum. So there was a referendum and the constitution was rejected. So in the second round of constitution making, the Kenyans obviously decided that they would head this off at the pass, and they created a court, this court, with some international judges on it from other parts of Africa to try to de-Kenyanize the litigious process if it's erupted again, which to some extent it did. So to the extent that there is now a new Constitution of Kenya that was effective, although there's some quite critical literature on that court. But the fourth example, and this really comes back a little bit to what Roberto was giving you in his example, is the use of foreign judges in small states, of which there are a lot in the world and a lot in the Pacific Islands. I mean, most of the Pacific Island countries are microstates, and some of them are very microstates. And there is an extensive use of foreign judges, which you can describe as supplementing capacity or maybe capacity building. And the problem of capacity is directed to a number of different things. One is the small size of the relatively small size of those countries, some smaller than others. Another is the relative poorness of the legal education that's available to them. Some of the best Pacific Island law students are in law courses around the world, so some of them are doing very good degrees, but a lot of them go to the University of the South Pacific, which is a great institution in the sense that it's culturally lovely and very appropriate, but educationally, in some respects, it's weak, and it's also weak as far as government funding support is concerned. And there are other weaknesses, capacity weaknesses, that Pacific Island lawyers have as well, also in terms of simply collecting your judicial decisions and making them publicly available, and that in systems that ostensibly at least subscribe to the doctrine of precedent, for example, is a significant problem. So I want to give you just some examples of some of the difficulties, well, some of the non-difficulties, but also some of the difficulties that have arisen in relatively recent times through the use of foreign judges in these states. Now, the sort of the non-controversial, non-difficulty example I'm giving you here is the Pacific Island state of Samoa. I could equally have chosen a whole range of others, Kiribati, Tonga. I partly did Samoa because I know Debbie's appeared before the court, and I thought she could give you some first-hand information as well. Impossible to tell from anything that I could find on the public record whether there were foreign judges on the Supreme Court of Samoa at all. The only way I worked it out was going to the judgments of the Court of Appeal of Samoa, which are online, and looking at the names of the judges and recognising them as all New Zealanders. So you have to do a certain amount of detective work if you're going to be interested in this topic going further. But as far as I could see, all three of the judges on the Court of Appeal in a lot of the cases in 2014 were New Zealand judges. And indeed, as a generalisation, the judges in many of these Pacific Island states come from either Australia or New Zealand. In any case that's vaguely complicated, the lawyers that appear before them are likely also to come from Australia and New Zealand, and in the absence of any local precedent that is handily available, the precedents will also be cited from the law of Australia and New Zealand, sometimes notwithstanding constitutional differences. So that is the ordinary course of events, and I'm sure it operates a little bit differently from country to country, but that's the deal. Now, let me give you three rather sort of stranger turns on this. Vanuatu, and this is just a war story, really, very hard to substantiate, but I was in Vanuatu about 10, 15 years ago and happened to meet the Chief Justice. I think he was shopping with his dog, and he fell upon me because I was such a nice visiting lawyer. And he told me he'd just taken up the position as Chief Justice. Now, Vanuatu was once a French-English condominium, and it still is a francophone state. And the UK government was going to provide the position of Chief Justice via foreign aid. But for that, it needed to find someone who spoke French and who was also a lawyer. So where would you go to find one of those in the United Kingdom? Well, you'd go to the island of Jersey. And there you would find a fairly junior criminal lawyer, and you'd say to him, would you like to be the Chief Justice of Vanuatu? And he'd say yes. And so off you would go on a two-year contract. And then when the contract came to an end, it would either be renewed or it wouldn't be renewed. And if you're the Chief Justice of Vanuatu, facing either being Chief Justice on a Pacific island or going back to some lowly position at the British Bar, you might like to stay there. And to stay there, you've got to be pretty nice to the government. And so over time, this guy's contract was renewed and renewed until finally, I think the government changed and he was run out of town. So that was a sort of my introduction to this some of the interesting questions that arise in this situation. My third example, Timor-Leste. Not strictly speaking, I suppose, the Pacific, but in any event, a neighbouring country to Australia. And this was actually what was on my mind when Jens and I had this discussion last year, because this great scandal had just erupted in Timor. A quarter of the Timorese judiciary was provided by Portugal. Again, I think, in the form of some sort of foreign assistance. And why? Because Portugal was the former colonial power of Timor-Leste. And the government had decided that it wanted to get rid of these people very quickly. It had a closed session of parliament. Their contracts were cancelled and they were all deported. And there was a huge fuss, as you might imagine. Australia drew out all its big guns and sent a representative from the Bar Council of the Northern Territory to East Timor to complain about their activities, and various other international organisations complained. I have no idea what were the rights and wrongs of this. The Timorese themselves, or the Timorese government, said that the problem was that these courts were in cahoots with some international oil company and had just handed down a decision that cost them hundreds of millions of dollars. The story from the judges and some of the Western commentators was that these judges were about to investigate the corruption of the Timorese government and had to be got out of town quickly. Who knows? I tried to find out. It was impossible. All I can tell you is that the problem seems to have completely disappeared in the few months that have erupted since then. The judges have gone, but presumably their places have either been filled or not filled by other judges, and the corruption allegations certainly haven't come to light, but that doesn't prove anything either. And then the final example I just want to give you is an example that went on over a period of time in Fiji. And Fiji is one of the larger Pacific islands, but nevertheless for a long time also relied largely on Australia, New Zealand and occasionally UK judges. And Fiji has had a lot of constitutional crises over the last decade or so. And one of them, quite early towards that period, involved a coup, as a result of which the Constitution was abrogated. And someone managed to get this case about abrogation of the Constitution before a court, and the court said, no, it's not abrogated. You can't do that to constitutions. And that court was all completely comprised of Australian or New Zealand judges. I can't quite remember which. Now, on one side, that's good. Here's a court that's got nothing to do with local politics, coming out with this beautifully principled decision. On the other hand, is it quite so good? I mean, they've got no stake in this at all. But nevertheless, the Constitution, amazingly, I thought, the government said, oh, all right then, and the Constitution was unabrogated, and everybody went back to work until the next coup. And then the government pretended for some time that actually they were operating under the Constitution, until once again someone got that matter before a court, again staffed by entirely foreign judges. Again, the court said, no, you're not operating consistently with the Constitution, get back to it at once. And this time the government said, okay, we'll abrogate the Constitution, and as there's no longer a Constitution, out you go. And that led to the period of military government that has only very recently come to an end in Fiji. Now, they're all just anecdotal stories, but they're all, as far as I'm aware, stories that have happened, and some of those things I've followed more closely than others. What does the constitutional framework typically say in making provision for foreign judges? Again, this requires more research, but as far as I can see, most of these constitutions make whatever is regarded as the appropriate provision for national judges, generally life appointment, appointment to retirement, occasionally terms or non-renewable terms, with relatively little, if any, reference to the complications of international judges. And that's why I say that I think very often this stuff is sort of managed informally by contracts and foreign aid arrangements. And as you can see from those examples I gave you, if you're interested in judicial independence of people who are in fact foreign judges, governments who are minded to remove these judges have a lot of additional tools at their disposal. I mean, they're not just reliant on coming together and finding proved misbehaviour or incapacity. They can simply not or ask their foreign donor not to remove the contracts, or they can remove the visa and deport the judge in question. And that indeed has just happened in the Pacific Island country of Nauru, which has gone through a lot of very exciting times. Had a Chief Justice who is in fact a lawyer based in Melbourne. Debbie and I know him very well, who was unwise enough to come home for a little while and found his visa was withdrawn and he was not allowed back into the country. And finally he can't remember whether he resigned or they removed him, but anyway, he's been replaced. So you can see the issues that arise, and there are issues on both sides here. To some extent, these arrangements are necessary in some of these countries, or necessary in some way. They provide capacity, they may reinforce trust, they may ensure constitutional compliance. But if you're interested in the legitimacy of national judiciaries, if you're interested in reflective judiciaries, representation, recognition on the part of the population. To go back to yesterday's discussions, if you take seriously the cultural dimensions of national law, and if you take seriously the requirement for some of these courts to actually apply customary law, then these are issues that you need to have some regard to. So there are tensions there. There are a string of accountability problems. The accountability for the decisions of the foreign judges, the accountability of the elected branches of the country concerned in their dealings with the judiciary, including the foreign judiciary, and the accountability of international donors and other international actors for the appointments that they make, for the appropriateness of those appointments, and for any compliance in dodging around the rules. Clearly there are implications for judicial independence, not just the independence of the foreign judges, but in relation to the precedent that's set for the national judges. I found another article online very recently from another Chief Justice of a Pacific island who was a local, saying we don't want any more foreign judges, they cost too much, we have to pay them more and we have to fly them here. And it seems to me that even if you accept that in the short term there are advantages for capacity, trust and constitutional compliance, in the longer terms there can be problems for capacity, trust and constitutional compliance because you may not be capacity building, you may just be capacity supplementing. So the question is, what are the solutions? Now, interestingly, there are some signs of change already. There is a little bit of a literature growing on this issue, and it's quite critical. And there are also some new directions in practice. Now, I haven't looked at what's going on around the world. There's quite a lot of this use of foreign judges in the Caribbean, quite a lot in Africa too, I think. But what's certainly happening in our parts of the world is that some of the Pacific Islands have gone right off Australia and gone off New Zealand to a lesser extent. New Zealand's a much nicer jurisdiction to deal with in this regard. But Fiji now has its own appointed judges. Some of them happen to be people who are been brought in and have been nationals of other countries, so they're not indigenous or Indo-Fijians, but the Fijians are now controlling their own judiciary. And interestingly, the Nauruans when they got rid of that Australian Chief Justice the other day, appointed a Chief Justice from Fiji. And I thought that was quite interesting and actually potentially positive, because the person that they appointed is a really very good lawyer and a really great guy. On the other hand, they appointed him on a 3-year contract, which didn't seem to me to be such a great idea. So there are some signs of change, and I think we can probably we will see that movement occurring. But more proactively, there's a question of what we might think about this. Do we think this is a problem, and if so, what might be done? It does seem to me that if foreign judges are going to be used in the long term, the constitutional framework needs to face up to that and needs to have a much more transparent constitutional set of arrangements that are tailored to the reality of foreign judges, that acknowledge that they will probably be only there for a period of time, that talk about the qualifications for appointment, and that perhaps inhibit reappointment in order to deal with problems of partiality. Maybe there should be a greater use of judges from other parts of the neighbouring region, whether we're talking Africa, where I think it already happens, the Caribbean and the Pacific. It may be a good idea to build up a pool of Pacific judges that can deal with these capacity problems. Maybe on courts as they sit, there should be a more careful mix of international and national judges rather than having a court comprised completely of international judges. Maybe you should insist on a mixture of the kind that you have in the Balkans and of the kind that you have in, say, Hong Kong. There was a recent article that I read by someone, a New Zealand scholar, I think, saying that international judges should show deference. I'm always a bit nervous about the idea of deference on the part of judges, and it wasn't entirely clear to me who deference was supposed to be shown to, whether it was the views of other national judges or the views of the government. Those are quite different outcomes. And then maybe you may have some ideas about where we might go from here. But that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. Are there any questions, any comments, any experiences to be shared? Yes, Fred, Debbie, Jens.
Just a comment, and it is such an interesting presentation. I haven't thought about at all. I mean, and when I often have seminars I teach my students, as a joke, I say, you've all heard of Doctors Without Borders, and of course they've all heard of Doctors Without Borders, and then I say, what about Lawyers Without Borders? And they laugh because it's much more complicated and historical and whatnot. But here it's Judges Without Borders, or am I, so partly in the Pacific, can one assume that they are all talking the same legal language, or are they going to diagnose the problem quite differently, coming from one place or another? And related to that, it also reminds me, in the international or global realm, the use of arbitration, where you essentially have private judges making extraordinarily important decisions chosen by the major players, and with very little judicial scrutiny. I mean, there's a touchdown usually someplace, but it's not much. And so this is, in any event, I'm curious as to whether there is a kind of basic, fundamental legal common language there, or really are they just reaching out to bring in tabula rasa or someone who doesn't know very much?
Debbie?
Thank you. As Cheryl said, I spent some time in Samoa arguing cases before the Court of Appeal and also working the Attorney General's Department. They're on some capacity building with young lawyers. And can I make a number of observations from that? Firstly, something to bear in mind with a country like Samoa is that they have an Indigenous Chief Justice who's a very good lawyer and a very interesting gentleman. And they have a number of other local judges. But it's very frequently the case that those people who have decided the case at first instance and might otherwise be qualified to sit on the Court of Appeal. I think when I was there they had like 4 local judges who were Supreme Court judges, but they all had conflicts of interest, usually because they were related to the parties or they had financial interests in the properties that were involved, because it's a small country, a small community. So if you were to rid them of the conflicts of interest, the only way to do that was to bring in judges from outside Samoa. So to some extent, bringing in foreign judges performs that independent function of ridding the court of conflicts of interest. That's on the positive side. On the negative side, I think the negative side is greater than the positive side. And you could see very clearly in Samoa where they have inherited the common law, but they are free to pick and choose what kind of common law they want to apply. So who constitutes their Court of Appeal is very important. If you have 3 New Zealanders there, their law becomes completely coloured by New Zealand law. Coming from Australia and arguing an administrative law case, it's very different. I mean, the New Zealand administrative law is very different. So they had never had any Australian cases cited to them. And as New Zealand judges, they were very resistant to it. As Cheryl said, think about the constitutional dimensions. There you have 3 judges coming from a country with no written constitution. So those sorts of issues, the background of those judges means they shape the law of those countries in particular ways very heavily. That's one point. The last point I want to make is about the customary law issues. Because, for example, on the Samoan Court of Appeal, those judges deal with appeals from the Samoan land courts, which are operated entirely in accordance with Samoan customary law and in Samoan. But, of course, then you have 3 white New Zealand judges sitting on the appeal court, and the cost, they have to translate everything that was before the Samoan the land court into English so that the Palangi judges that come from overseas can understand what's going on. So there are all these resource implications, apart from flying them, putting them up, whatever. And I don't think that's good. Now, a lot of capacity building needs to be done to change the situation in those countries. My observation was I didn't see the New Zealand judiciary involved in any of that capacity building. I mean, it's clearly these judges like to come and they're very happy with the circumstances. They do a very diligent job. They take their job seriously, but there wasn't a lot of interest in building the capacity of the local profession that I saw. So those are my observations.
Thank you very much. Well, both you and yes.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's just following the question of Debbie, the question of the language skills of the judges. I don't know, unfortunately I'm not very familiar with the situation in the Pacific area, but here in Europe, be it in Kosovo, be it in Bosnia, English is not the common language of the judges. First of all, the Albanians in Kosovo, the Kosovars have not all of them are really fluent in English. On the other hand, for the foreign judges, it's very difficult, of course, to read the documents. And if they are depending on translations, I wonder if they are real independent judges. It's, by the way, the same problem with our European Court of Human Rights. But this is a real problem, and I think we have to think about it. The second thing is here, again, specifically with reference to the European situation, the participation of Western judges or foreign judges was intended to be for a transitional period. And now have a look at Bosnia-Herzegovina, that's 20 years. Kosovo, it's now 16 years. It's going on and nobody sees an end. And the question will be, what is the purpose of it?
And I try to link to both of what has been said, because I think this is really very, very important, that probably there is no idea of how can this end. So there is not a drive from the inside, and the international community seems to lose patience, especially in the Balkans, in particular in Bosnia. And I interpret also the Venice Commission opinions in this way, that there's a kind of let's end all these ethnic divisions, a kind of impatience. No? And this brings me to the question of legitimacy and the question also of what you were addressing with the external judge. I think we have to distinguish, and I wonder whether we can maybe terminologically, in a way, distinguish between, as you called your presentation, foreign judges and international judges. Because I'm more convinced that international judges should have a further qualification, so that there is a kind of international set of values or whatever, a kind of international common foundation for the mission of these judges, something which is broader than just merely being a foreigner in I don't know, at least as a kind of theoretical distinction, which then has to be, of course, verified in each case. And I was really impressed what you called a careful mix of judges, rather than having foreign judges, for example, in the cases, in the problematic cases you indicated, from one country. So this was one point. The other point was the question of, again, of transition and permanent, and again the value thing comes in here, whether you need external advice for a permanent situation and just for diversifying your judiciary body, or whether you need to change a situation in also introducing values from the outside. And here, of course, the Bosnian court, for example, but in a way also Kosovo is a point. In the Bosnian court, there is even the nomination by the president of the Court of Human Rights. So there's this strong idea of international human rights, which justifies and legitimizes this. No? But the question is actually whether this can be permanent or not. Yeah. But in terms of a question, my 2 points have struck me. One is the foreign aid, because I think this is in general a problem, donors and what donor coordination and so on, but especially that foreign judges or international judges are paid by foreigners. This I find very peculiar, and if you can say something maybe, or an anecdote or whatever. And the other thing was the question with these short-term contracts. Especially these two things, which are in stark contrast to judicial independence, as always foreseen, and this has really struck me.
Maybe, Aida, you want to add something about Andorra? One of our colleagues, Laurence, is a constitutional judge in Andorra. If I remember correctly, there is a provision according to which you must be a Catholic.
Oh, yeah? Is
that
right?
In Andorra, yes.
Because I know people who've been on the
that's another case
to
add about it. Okay, just would you like to give an answer?
On Andorra?
If you like to.
Yeah, no. Particularly, yes, let me give an answer. Fred's question was, how can this be, is the assumption that they all sort of speak the same legal language. The assumption is that they all do speak English, and of course, at some point down the chain, the ordinary people may or may not speak English. They certainly have their own languages, and many of their customary documents, which is what Debbie was talking about, I think, will be in the local language. They certainly won't be spoken by the foreign judges. Insofar as the proceedings are not dealing with customary law, I imagine that they're all in English, aren't they, Debbie, at the Court of Appeal level? Yeah. It's a little bit like what we were saying yesterday. You go down to the lower courts and then you'll find the local language. Once you go up the appellate chain in a common law system, then you run into, then it's likely to be English everywhere, partly reflecting the assumptions of the common law. East Timor is different because they're doing Portuguese. But more importantly than that, in the sense, is that they speak in the same legal language. Well, yes, in the sense that they're all common law countries, and all imported common law countries. And in fact, I think the Constitution of Samoa contemplates judges being appointed from outside Samoa, from countries with a similar legal system. But, I mean, everything we've said here for the last couple of days is that, the law is not the law is not the law. I mean, this morning's session, it matters, gender matters, or ethnic perspective might matter. All sorts of perspective matters. Yesterday, we're talking about Indigenous law, and to some extent, we're talking about Indigenous law here. So it is actually quite interesting to see the debate on this. So insofar as there is now a debate coming up, you can find Indigenous legal leaders in some of these Pacific Island countries saying, listen, this is just Western law being superimposed as a blanket, and it's got to be adapted to our own ways of life and assumptions. And Western leaders, the Australian High Commissioner to Fiji, for example, saying, it's law, it's all right, it'll be okay. So there's the usual range of views on that. But in this particular company where we've really been talking about this, clearly there's an issue to be dealt with there, and particularly when they're then applying custom. But not only. There are examples from Samoa. There was the one that you were involved in where they were dealing with electoral law, and there are others dealing with how freedom of speech operates in that sort of cultural context. You can imagine all sorts of issues that might arise.
Now, if I may, now we have coffee break, which I suppose will be very, very short. But let me add to this that one difficulty that customary law or indigenous laws encounters in these cases is that it has its own background. Let me give an example. It was mentioned yesterday by Alexandra that the Universal Declaration mentions intellectual property, and also what I find very interesting, traditional know-how. The traditional capacity to handle a number of situations. Now, for many indigenous communities, intellectual property is for good, whereas normally intellectual property is protected for a number of years, whether it is 10, 15, or 20. And it is very difficult to convince the indigenous populations that whatever rights they have is for a limited number of times, of years, also because that is really a sort of intergenerational property, intergenerational communal property, which does not know and does not conceive time limits. So in all such cases, I wonder to what extent foreign judges, more than international judges, may then meet such cultural requirements, which may take some time to be explained and ultimately accepted. And the same happens in Africa, of course. Okay, so, yes, please.
If I heard well, so it seems that also all the judges are from north and they go to south, or from west going to east. So there is definitely a power element there. Sorry?
With the exception of New Zealand, they're going north.
New Zealand is notional north.
Have you had, maybe, I don't know a lot about Andorra. Is there a power of element there, kind of?
No, I think
Andorra is a shared government between, yeah.
Oh, okay.
I think Andorra is sui generis here. It's okay. The French-Spanish thing is.
Yeah. So you haven't heard of any examples of judges from the south being used in the north, or of Eastern Europe being used?
Well, they're just immigrants, their children go to law school,
yes,
and then they become judges in
the
common law
integrated.
Yes, right. And then
Eastern
they go
Europeans.
back to the south, but as representative of the north. Yes, please.
I'm not sure. I thought Fred had raised this point, but I'm going to come back to it anyway. The idea of the difference between this and a kind of privatized judicial system, which is very common. Either you get foreign companies using London courts in London to use, or else you get them essentially buying a well-known retired judge or leading QC or whatever to do it for them. It seems to me that there's a sort of parallel there. The other parallel, I have to say, is with professional rugby players who have no one here will know anything at all about rugby. Well, some of you, sorry. European rugby, where you're only allowed two or three. Well, that's obviously true. Two or three foreign players, and their job is to come along and develop the skills of the local players. But very often their job is to come along and collect a huge paycheck when they're slightly past it for playing in New Zealand or where else. But anyway, that's a small aside.
Yeah, look, Fred did raise the arbitration thing, and I think it's a fair point to raise. I mean, I'm a little bit tempted to say, well, you know, arbitration between large business groups is one thing, whereas sort of day-to-day litigation in a state is another. But in any event, there is such a lot of controversy about these new free trade agreements and its implications for taking justice out of states and away from courts that are accountable through traditional mechanisms to God knows who, controlled by God knows who, to resolve issues which may be very economically important to people and which may involve intellectual property in all sorts of ways. So this is, I mean, I've been interested to see the debate about this in the United States, Fred, because there's been a huge debate about it in Australia, where everybody regards the United States as being a predator, and I thought now that it's breaking out in the US as well, we should be really sort of taking this seriously. So I think that's another. I mean, you're right, but I think it's part of the problem as well in some respects, or it's part of the matter that needs to be considered, the subject matter of this sort of project.
So thank you very much, Cheryl, also for this second session and for the contribution that you gave, and also thanks to all of us for the discussion. I think that it was absolutely correct for the two of you to introduce this particular window of a reality which is usually neglected, but appears to be rich and stimulating. I suggest to have not more than 15 minutes of break, as I'm afraid that a part of our audience will be tempted to leave and won't be able to stay here until the very end. And that would be, of course, something to avoid. So 15 minutes back here. Thank you.
Sorry, yes. I didn't answer your question, but actually